So welcome back to Movement Science Degrees of Freedom. And in this episode, we have a chance to talk to Steve Sparks. We explore some key articles that have helped him along the way. And that takes us into the world of considering the management of hip and groin. We explore the use of strength and strength testing. And if a muscle tests weak in strength testing, what do we do about that? Does it mean we need to use a strength training intervention? We get back into the world of tension arcs. We touch on CMAS and SMAS. We talk about transfer of training. We talk about selectives or correctives. And we dive back into terminology around loading and variability. So it's an excellent exploration of these topics and probably a deeper dive than we had in the previous episode. And I'm really hoping you enjoy it, this conversation between myself, Andy, and Steve Sparks. Andy, actually, where are you right now?
I am in a hotel room in the Hamptons working with an NBA player who's here right now. So, yeah, early morning start for me.
Yeah, so given it's 11:07 in the UK, you can do the mathematics around that one.
Yeah.
And Steve Sparks, hello.
Hello, thanks for inviting me back.
Yeah, and you're down in the sort of towards south coast of the UK right now.
Yes, yeah. So south coast is where I'm from. So I'm down sort of close to like Bournemouth area at the moment. Yeah, visiting some family.
I'm keen to sort of talk about some key articles. So with Andy, I asked the question about what sort of articles have been sort of informative, help the concepts and philosophy along the way. And Steve, I'd be keen to sort of hear about sort of things you sort of think, for me, that's been a really key article and that sort of changed my thinking, or did actually the opposite. I saw that and I thought, well, no, that can't be right. And I want to do it differently to that.
Okay. Wow. Big question. I mean, I'm terrible at remembering articles and stuff, if I'm being honest. Like my memory for stuff like that's awful.
That doesn't make you a good practitioner. I'm the same. Remembering references does not mean good practitioner, but
no,
anyway.
like you know, I've read a lot, and I guess you, like most people, you take what you take from it. I can't necessarily always remember where it came from. I think in terms of the world that we talk about in terms of movement, I think one of the most interesting articles for me was a few years ago now. It was the Ender King paper around. I think there was a couple of hundred people with hip and groin pain that had failed previous rehab and were on the route potentially towards a surgical intervention, and they went to obviously were entered into his research study and went through their protocol, and the protocol was fantastic in the fact that I guess it's the same kind of framework that I've grown up with in terms of movement and kinetic control, in terms of breaking the body down into regions of, well, my hip and groin is around my pelvis and groin area, and then I'm going to look at how the person moves above and below those areas, so sort of breaking the body into different segments and looking at how they control movement around it. And obviously they did some biomechanical analysis and looked at trunk, pelvis, femur, shank, etc. And the fantastic thing was, I think, from what I remember, the vast majority of those with hip and groin pain, and it didn't really matter what the hip and groin pain was. It went from pubic stress to FAI type symptoms to, anything adductor related groin pain, iliopsoas, the abdominal list went on of all of the variables around hip and groin pain, and they all had very similar, very common movement faults. And the process that they used for the rehabilitation was, right, well, we're going to take you in the gym, we're going to give you some slow, controlled, thoughtful movement of these body segments, and then we're going to build that up with it wasn't even necessarily traditional. I think some of it was a traditional strength training program, some was specific, but from what I remember, the thing that I massively agreed with was that there wasn't any targeted adductor loading. There was no sort of Copenhagen plank type variations within the program. It was just general movement, control of above and below, strengthen the regions generally in terms of the quads, glutes, hamstrings around that. Glutes obviously broken into the various components. Biomechanical analysis, change of direction analysis, etc. And then at the end of the study, reanalyzed everybody, and they'd all the vast majority had improved. I can't remember what it was. I think it was a high percentage of, I think it was around 90% or something. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it was very high. And they'd all improved in terms of their trunk control, femur on pelvis, pelvis on femur, shank. I think they proved that there was more work coming from the ankle in terms of running and change of direction. So the athletes previously with hip and groin pain had been working harder at their hip, which may well have been a contributing factor towards the hip and groin pain. And actually through Ender's paper, they showed that by offloading and I guess through more appropriate distribution of synergies and energy transfer, more happened at the ankle. That offloaded the hip, and lo and behold, the vast majority managed to avoid surgery. I think a small number did go on and have surgery, but in a cohort of over 200, that's fairly reasonable. And I think some had hip and groin pain for about 4 years or something. So, that's not unusual to go and have surgery at some point. So I think that was a paper that really kind of hammered home the beliefs that I've had in the way that I've worked for a long time. And what was nice to finally see was, well, I've seen this in my own practice and people's practice that I've worked with we know this works. And suddenly there was a large cohort study that I was like, okay, somebody's proved that maybe this is the way that as physios and S&Cs we should be thinking about injuries and movement in terms of force distribution, etc., and changing the way people move from an efficiency point of view and muscle synergy. And it was great that they didn't specifically target muscles from a strength point of view. It was just general improvement of strength. And I guess that's how I tend to work. Like I'm somebody that you need to prove me otherwise, that I need to strengthen your hamstring or I need to strengthen your adductor. If it tests weak, is that just because it's weak, or is it because it's tired, because it's overworking, because of the lack of synergy and coordination amongst other body segments?
Is it inhibited?
Yeah, so it's inhibited. Like if I test it and it's tired, it's going to test weak. So I'm a big believer of, I'm not going to strengthen it until you prove to me that it's weak. And then I think Ender's paper was, really hammered home that kind of philosophy to me. So that's probably a seminal paper over the last few years I've really gone, wow, look, why aren't people doing more of this? And I think a lot of people seem to come back and reference him now. And I've seen a few lectures recently, even with sprint mechanics and straight line running, they actually come back and reference Ender, even though he wasn't specifically looking at straight line running. Yeah.
But they're making change, aren't they, from a program and intervention, and then seeing a different outcome in terms of the movement strategy used for that action.
100%.
I think for me too, I totally agree. I love that he's done studies like that are not localized to a specific injury or tissue or structure, but more a global general movement quality, improve the movement quality, get an outcome in the region where there was pain. I mean, it's just, and like you say too, like the monitoring that goes on right now is just so based around, a lot of it is just like isometric strength. Have they got that strength, or is it weak or strong? And then they make decisions on increasing strength around that, as opposed to, well, what's going on from a movement perspective. And not that isometric strength is important, but like you're saying, is it lost force output because it is weak, or is it actually inhibited because of what's going on around the hip or other areas of the body that just you've lost muscle synergy, and the muscle becomes inhibited. And the hamstring specifically, like that, the hamstring monitoring that I see often focuses on that. And it's like, well, maybe if you improve the synergy around that and make those silly hamstrings smarter, as we've touched on before, Lincoln, then you'll get a better outcome in terms of the strength without even touching the hamstring or even trying to load it.
No, I completely agree. And I use, like a lot of practitioners, I'll use isometric like profiling as
sure,
as part of a battery of information, and I think again it's a monitoring until proven otherwise. I'm not necessarily going to intervene with this if I think there are issues elsewhere. And it's important to not take that one test in isolation, isn't it? Of like build that picture of, well, what are the other muscles that we're isometrically testing looking like, but also what are the movement patterns around that from a movement profiling perspective and assessment perspective looking like, and can we maybe investigate some of the other areas around the hip and the pelvis first, because we may actually improve their strength assessment and profile without having to necessarily intervene from a strength point of view. And I think, as we discussed last time, the schedule that you spoke about when you worked in basketball, if they've got a strength issue, when are you necessarily going to intervene from a strength perspective? So I need to be 100% sure this is a strength issue before I try and crowbar some strength into this guy's program.
Could cause more of an issue. It might be an underlying fatigue related problem and just loading it even more when it's disadvantaged because of other underlying factors that you've not taken into consideration.
Yeah, and conversely to that, I've often seen players that have a history of hamstring issues, but then actually when you test them, whether from it's an isometric perspective or whether from a Nordic board perspective, they're actually incredibly strong and their force production is really, really good. But people still want to strengthen their hamstrings, and you're like, okay, well, where's the end point of this? How strong is strong? What about all these other factors of they're really poor in their trunk, they can't control it, they don't actually have good trunk endurance. There's lots of other issues around their pelvis and their lumbar spine that are probably low-hanging fruit that we can look at before we say we need to make their hamstrings even stronger.
I feel like in general, since like Nordics have been kind of popularized, hamstring strength has gone up across the board, but that hasn't really changed, hamstring injury rates.
Yeah.
And there's been some discussion, and I've had this discussion recently with a few other colleagues around, is it actually force production or force transmission? And like you said, like what's going on in the trunk control and the hip control, and is the hamstring muscle actually too strong at times for the musculotendinous junction to cope with the force that's being produced, and is there an excessive stiffness around there? So there's it's interesting when you're just solely focusing on strength, because I think it seems like hamstrings are getting stronger, but we're not seeing as much change in the type of injury rates that we're seeing still.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, excellent. I mean, there's huge amounts there to explore. So the intersegmental approach taken by Andy King, that's sort of the term he uses, and I like that term as well. I know sometimes when we talk about intersegmental, people think we're just talking about the spine, but from a biomechanics perspective, that's just not the way. We're talking about segments working together, and within a framework of movement management, we would talk about segments and how they interact and how they coordinate and how individuals coordinate those segments. This would place the bias on saying that how somebody moves matters, that it's somebody we need to perhaps consider rather than just focusing on the tissue at risk. So by just focusing on the tissue at risk, then we're also drawn towards symptoms of those tissues. So there's a bias towards the tissue and there's a bias towards the symptoms. I'll manage the symptoms and just focus on the tissue that complains, rather than using this sort of systems management approach, which is looking at the whole system, the individual. And then those other ideas, Andy, about your sort of scaling that into sport actions, that when they're in a sport, it's a bigger system. It's the whole component of the individual environment and task to perform.
Yep.
So there's that element of this. There's risk factor management then. So being able to identify what are those risk factors for given outcomes. And because it's easy to test strength, we talked about this in previous times, you find what you test. So if you can test it, you can find it, and then you've got a reasoned intervention. And also that becomes then what described as evidence-based. If it just so happens that making those changes, there's a study that shows that, that did at this time reduce injury risk, or it did at this time identify players who had weaker hamstrings, the ones went on to sustain the injury. Post-injury, the 2018 paper that we did when we looked at Nordics, and we looked at the bicep femoris activation of players with a previous hamstring injury compared to the glutes recruitment and their medial hamstring recruitment, their bicep femoris recruited more. And people interpreted that as, oh, that's good then, because your intervention strategies must have worked because they've got more recruitment in the previously injured tissues. But indeed, yes, it could be because these hamstrings have been disadvantaged in some way. There's some sort of maybe there is a component of inhibition, but it comes out that they have to work harder, and their synergists also could be experiencing some sort of inhibition of some sorts. That means that they're working less. The bicep femoris has to pick up the work, pays the bill. It could be because these muscles already have an element of fatigue in them, and that's why you're seeing more EMG coming off these things. So that was badly interpreted, I feel.
Yeah.
And missing the point of having a framework of how you look at muscles working together, muscle synergies, and the muscle classification models really help with that. And it seems that what we're talking about within the King's work also has an element of this. By placing focus on other regions and seeing that's what I describe as moment distribution change. So you're getting more work from the ankle, less work from the hip.
Yeah.
And we see that as well with the trunk interaction. So if we have more trunk lean, we've got more hip extensor moment.
Yep.
And that starts to shift the focus away from the ankles and the knee. And people use this in running retraining as a way to say, oh, well, if you've got problems with your knees, more trunk lean. Well, that's great, unless you've got a problem with your hip extensors. Yeah, because now you've biased the hip
Reflexes
to save the knee, but then all of a sudden your hip extensors are going to have a bit more of a problem now. So that could be why trunk lean is sometimes associated with hamstring risk factors. The component of the Copenhagen, Steve. So what is what is the issue with that one?
I guess for me, the Copenhagen plank, and I don't really like calling it that. It was an adductor plank before it was a Copenhagen plank, but that's my own pet peeve around it. It's the adductor version of the Nordic, isn't it? It's not a bad exercise for me, but you have to choose why you want to do it. I know it's an isometric, obviously, versus an eccentric of the Nordic, but you need to choose and reason why you want to do it. Ultimately, it's a very high load isometric. So it's almost like you're taking what we know about tendons and liking high load from an isometric point of view to try and improve the vascularization and blah, blah, blah around the tendon health and the collagen matrix, etc., and putting it into the adductor. But it's like everyone forgets that actually to do that around that region, my pubic symphysis is something that often in elite sport, in athletes that have to change direction, etc., and kick, is often a little bit worn away and unstable. So to do that exercise is often very provocative with the wrong person. And it takes nothing into the thought process around control of that region. And it's an isometric, which, okay, we know maybe 20 degrees of movement either way, you kind of get a change in muscle architecture and effect. But more often than not, in change of direction sports and kicking, and even just running, it doesn't change anything in terms of strength through range. So like when these guys are kicking or they're changing direction, you're often going into outer range through to inner range, and it just doesn't address that. So for me, I would clinically reason using it if I'm sure that this person has a fairly stable pelvis and they have a true adductor longus tendon related issue where I might want to put some isometric load into the tendon. And I would do that thoughtfully. Like I've seen people doing 30-second, minute-long kind of holds in these really provocative positions, and I just think it's unnecessary where you can change that in other ways. And I would look at trying to often strengthen more outer range positions first, and the adductor squeeze test is a great example of that. When it was brought in with the first paper, I think was it Laval or something like that, or Laval, it was just using your hand, and it was just part of a bed-based assessment of, I'll put my hand between your knees, squeeze my fist. Is that painful? Yes or no? And it was more of just a clinical reasoning of, if you say no, probably don't have a pubic or adductor related issue and I can move on. If it's painful, I need to do a further assessment. Then we started using sfigs and handheld dynies and stuff to assess it. And it's useful, but again, like you said, Andy, it's got to be part of a picture.
Yeah.
A lot of people, when you do that test, if they've got quite long legs, like long femurs and a wide pelvis, I'm in a really, really inner range position when I start to do those squeeze tests, particularly if it's a long lever adductor squeeze and I'm testing between their ankles. And more often than not, we're not in that position when we do sport. That's very, very inner range. And we test weak and inner range anyway. That's just part of our. So I more tend to look at mid and outer. And I just think things like the Copenhagen plank, I know there's variations of it. They don't really address it. You get bad execution of the exercise in terms of pelvic position, like lumbar extension, rotation around the femur, the pelvis. The trunk is not doing its fair share of work. It's like saying I'm going to squat somebody and like they've got really stiff ankles, they've got long femurs, they've got a narrow pelvis, and they tend to stand in an anterior pelvic tilt. If I'm going to squat you, I'm not going to get very far with doing that, because biomechanically you're not set up to do it.
Similar to like what we were saying about the hamstring, isn't it? You see this weak hamstring, painful hamstring. Let's target the bicep femoris and get it more dominant and overactive. Well, maybe it's just already being used excessively, and it's turning
100%.
Turning tonic when it should be phasic. We know, like, in those Copenhagens, you're really focusing mainly on the adductor longus. And one of the articles that we recently discussed, which really feeds into this, is the Tack and Langhart article, research that they did with the tension arc. And when you start to, lose range in the hip flexors, and you lose mobility through the trunk and that tension arc, you try and make it up somewhere else through maybe the pelvis, through shearing, but you also tend to increase your dominance of your adductor muscles for activation, to generate that velocity and that force and that torque. So they're already becoming quite dominant. So maybe, like we were saying before, there's another area that needs to be explored, as opposed to just focusing on, adductors, let's focus on doing a Copenhagen, increase the strength of them. When maybe it's a muscle synergy issue, or a segment order of movement issue, sequential firing issue, which that article in the Tack and Langhart goes into really nicely around the tension arc and how that relates to a lot of rotational sports. I think that's a great point that you make.
And that tension arc stuff, I know Phil Glasgow's done a lot of work in rugby of using that as day-to-day assessment and a part of his monitoring for, obviously, as a kicking sport. And he's very much talked about that. And I think that's really important, that when you lose that range of movement, you tend to start to have to make it up somewhere else. And his anecdotal experience when you talk to him is the guys that start to lose their baseline where we want them to be tension arc, they then start to develop hamstring or groin related issues.
Exactly.
And I agree that the Igor Tack paper is fantastic, and his PhD around that kind of stuff was brilliant. And so I completely agree. And in football and in kicking sports, like you said, the adductor longus is your main kicking muscle, really. So why would we want to continue to overload it when we haven't necessarily looked at the other synergies? And more often than not, a lot of these guys have some micro instability around their pubic symph and their pelvis, and we neglect adductor brevis. Adductor magnus has been proved to have multiple parts. Was it the Takazawa papers or whatever? I can't remember the name specifically, but I wrote an article on that a while back, and we don't really focus on the different parts of the adductor magnus, around how important the proximal part is for stabilizing the hip and the pelvis and kicking and stuff. So I think you have to really reason why you're picking those exercises, the same as the Nordic. Why am I doing it? If I'm going to do it, I need to have a really good reason as to why I'm going to do it. And the Copenhagen for me is the same.
Yeah.
So the word synergy has come up multiple times, and the Manshire paper that we wrote 2018 explores this in fairly scrutinizing detail of trying to share the work between muscles that share the same role. So muscles that share the same role, synergy, and taking the idea of synergy is muscles that share moments, as in they contribute biomechanically rather than they're just recruited within the same task. So if you consider synergies as that, all muscles recruited in the same task, you start to lose the difference between muscles that work together and those antagonistic muscles. So you still have that ability to decide who's doing what and when around a sort of co-activation around a joint. So muscles working together, they are one but not the same, as the song goes, in that they're different types of muscle because anatomically they are different. And there's a number of different criteria. You can look at any given muscle and say, well, that's why it's given this name, because it's different to that muscle, even though they're working together. Where did this get lost? Now, what I mean by that is, yeah, there's a lot of focus on outcomes and numbers and metrics of strength, but where did this focus on muscles being distinct entities, where did this get lost along the way? Because we're talking about this now in 2024 as if it's not novel, but something that's not widely adopted. What happened?
I don't know. I think is it just interpretation of literature? Is it maybe perhaps? I don't know.
Exactly. I think certain practitioners just banging the drum about you can't go wrong getting strong and saying stuff that is, very, I think, too simplistic at times. I think it's just a simple way to think about solving a problem, isn't it? Just strengthen everything, which obviously we need to be able to manage the forces that are exposed, but we need to modulate just as much. Modulation is the key for varying what muscles you're using at what times based off of what their roles are. And I just think there's maybe, like Steve says, a lack of understanding around the literature that's been put out there. Like you were saying before, Lincoln, about the hamstring bicep femoris activation and how that's been interpreted in that article. And I think there's, it's just how practitioners interpret information, and then how people are putting information out there. And I think a lot of the movement science stuff in the recent years has kind of been put on the back burner in terms of the importance of it.
Yeah.
Which is frustrating. But I think here lies an opportunity, because that needs to be addressed, and it isn't being addressed enough. And like people like N. the King are really at the forefront of this, which is great, because we want to see more of this type of research and information that's out there. But yeah, it's because there's many characteristics to actions, right? And obviously strength is a characteristic, but it is not the only characteristic. So I think that's how we got to approach it, and understanding what the environment is, what the task is, and what are the contributing things that are required to build overall robustness. And it's not just being strong.
Yeah, I would agree. I think when you look at the literature that's been out there for like the last decade, it's all very similar in terms of taking similar kind of cohorts and just assessing strength, whether it's in hamstrings or adductors, because in most sports, obviously the prevalence of injuries is still hamstrings and adductor. So the focus has been predominantly around those areas, and they're easy to assess from a strength point of view with the modern technology that we've got in terms of whether it's force plates or handheld dynies or rigs or whatever. It's easy to assess those things pre and post intervention, whereas I think it's harder to set up a movement related study to look at pre and post. And but as we discussed in the last podcast, biomechanics now of things is starting to become kind of more in vogue again, and you're getting more literature now around like mechanics of how we move, etc.
Yeah.
So maybe we're starting to enter that region. But I think my concern around those areas are, and we touched upon it last time, is in your environmental practice, nobody really has access to that kind of technology in terms of being able to assess. And I know, the CMAS and the SMAS are designed to obviously be more environmentally friendly, as it were, for the practitioner to be able to use. But then you start to just focus in on areas they're running in a straight line or they're changing direction like this. But we spoke about it last time in terms of the rest of the environment of the sport. Well, I'm never really going to run, or for maybe a fraction of a percentage am I going to run like this in a straight line when I'm playing a team sport. Very rarely am I going to be able to change direction like this when I'm having to change direction, because I've got a ball either in my hands or at my feet, or a stick I'm trying to control a ball with. I've got an opponent that may or may not be pushing me. And so they're useful pieces of information, but I think there's a lack of understanding of taking it into context of what you've got to do in terms of the sport. And that's why I loved your explanation last time of thinking about the actual task within the environment of what are we trying to achieve, and the relevance of what we're therefore doing from a physiotherapy or an S&C perspective.
Yeah, I think it's the variation in the choices that you need, because one action in isolation, it's good to get a baseline. It's good to see how they do that.
Yeah,
you're never going to do that one action in the same way. And when you're in a sporting environment, like you say, there's just if you're playing a team sport specifically, you're constantly having to communicate externally, internally, process information, make decisions, and then formulate and choose the type of action you want to take to execute that. Meanwhile, you're adjusting as well that action to fit the skill selection that you need, or the requirements, or the situation. So it's never exactly the same. So having a baseline of what the action's like, but then digging deeper in terms of, okay, so we know your technique for that action's like that, but what if we wanted to move slightly different in this situation? What is your choice if this situation happens? Can you control this part of your body and move this part of your body if this situation happens? And trying to break down the actions and look at the different segments and the quality of movement in isolation to then rebuild, to then provide more variability, so they get more adjustment and fluidity and capability of that within the natural sporting environment when those situations come about, I think is a really nice way to look at it. But I totally agree with what you're saying around the research and looking at outputs and how it's objective data that we're going from. But we don't necessarily know that it's a strength related issue that's causing those outputs. So again, we're looking at correlation and making an assumption. So we're doing a force test, but is the intervention strength, or is the force output because of something else? We've just gone down the route, or a lot of times we think, low strength or low force output equals more strength required. Well, that's not the case. So it could be a muscle synergy issue. It might well be that they have weakness, but if they have a baseline that originally wasn't weak, and over like a 2 or 3 week period you see a drop off in force output, then surely they haven't lost that type of strength in a short period of time. But are we changing the strategy? Are we looking at something else? And are we looking at it in context? But yeah, I agree. It's like understanding the environment is key, knowing what actions the players are required to do, and then what other characteristics within the environment that allow us to understand where the problem lies, and then breaking it down further, and knowing that we can't just do an isolated action assessment and think that that's going to really highlight where underlying movement related issues could be. I think it gives gives some more picture, and then you got to dig deeper again.
For tools like SMAS, CMAS, acknowledging that they can't replicate the sport, and not just from their biomechanical representation of the sport, but also just from all the other things going on in terms of what sport demands, all the communication components, what sport is, so all the things we've talked about in previous episodes of this. However, maybe it's beneficial that at least it becomes more ecologically valid. At least we're moving down that continuum, get it to more towards actions that are involved in the sport, rather than looking just at say, single joint testing. However, that still has a place. It's just knowing where it all fits together in this sort of hierarchy.
Yeah,
it all has a place. Yeah, I totally agree, Link. I think it all has a place. It's just knowing how to problem solve around that, and not just hanging your hat on one thing. Being open-minded to say, okay, this is some information. What other information do we need to look at before we make a decision on where the problem is and how we apply the intervention? Yeah, because you could look at somebody in a game setting, for instance, who you've identified that when they press, there's a problem. So pressing is the action. And if you said, okay, pressing's the problem, let's work on the basic action of sprinting and stopping. And when we look at the sprint and stopping, the technique's actually pretty good. The speed's good. Their ability to decelerate is actually really good. But we will just keep working on that. Well, maybe it's not that that's the problem. Maybe it's when they are pressing, there's some sort of decision-related issue or a communication, or they don't understand the strategy behind that. And that's where the problem lies. And that's what we should be focused on. And that's more of a, sport-specific coaching issue as opposed to a speed, quickness, and movement related issue from looking at it from a top down perspective. So that's just an example of understanding the context. And it doesn't mean that sprinting and stopping isn't an integral part of pressing. It is. It's a characteristic, it's an integral part, but it isn't. Sprinting and stopping is not pressing, and pressing is not sprint and stopping. It's an integral part of it. And the same as hip flexion extension, knee flexion extension. They are integral parts of sprinting and stopping, but they are not sprinting and stopping. They're just, you have to know what they are, where they are, and then know how to identify the problem at each level and then dig deeper.
So related to our podcast here, it's knowing the degree of freedom to go at. It's what is your degrees of freedom you're considering? What is the scale of analysis you're looking at? For how macro to micro do you go? Is it the sport, the individual in the sport action, or scaling it all the way down to a glide of a joint? How deep do you want to go? But it's possible. So it's worth considering where that sits into a bigger framework. So throw nothing out, evaluate it on its due merits. That ability now to vary motion, to display choice in action, and I would describe it as variability. So put the two words together, you can vary, and you've got the ability to vary. So variability. Anyway, how do we make sure? Okay, how do we make sure that? And this is sort of going, I think, to the sort of the Gabby Wolf stuff. And how do we make sure that we don't sort of make the athlete, the individual, just too focused on how they move and how it becomes automated, how it becomes sort of integrated into what they perform on the pitch, on the court? How do we go about that?
You want to start with that one, Steve, or do you want me to?
No, I think you've got some great experience, obviously, of doing that within your previous roles, Andy.
I think it's throwing it back to you there.
Yeah, no. So how do we make sure that they do have variation within their movement? I think, or how does it transfer? I mean, there's two slightly different sides to this. So transferability, I think, depends on the specificness of the problem that you're trying to solve, first of all. And if you've identified that, then there's more chance of you getting the transfer. And as I said before, you can improve someone's movement control, quality, variation, but that might not be where the problem lies, and they still might go into a game situation and not be able to move the way you want in certain situations because they have a decision-related issue or an anxiety issue or a communication issue that causes them to move. And that might be the problem that needs to be addressed in that scenario. However, if we have identified from analysis that the problem doesn't rely on communication or decision, and we've been through more of a strategic chronological assessment too, in terms of where that problem might rely, in terms of whether it's a position-related issue, can they get into bully position? Is it a timing-related issue? Is it a direction control or a speed-related issue? Then you can kind of dig deeper into where you need to focus and target again. And then once you've identified if it is a direction-related issue, for instance, because that would relate more about the control of joints and orientation of segments, and coordination and motor control, not just strength, obviously that's important too, but if you're focusing in on that, and you can target certain actions, and then you give cognitive feedback exercises where people are thinking about what they're doing with quality, and they're learning how to get in and out of certain positions that they may or may not want to be in, and you create challenges to the proprioceptive system, proprioceptively, and giving that feedback, and then removing feedback, and applying interventions around that, where they just ramp up body awareness in those areas that relate to that action, and they build it into an action. In my experience, and I think, in some of the stuff I'm showing that Enda King has published too, and other practitioners, I see great change in that, and I've seen improvements in movement efficiency, and in the technology that I use to assess that. So I think, it's really about the intervention that you use once you've identified where the problem is, and if you can really be specific and targeted with focused cognitive work and focus of body awareness, then I think that is a really good starting point to get good change. Because once the athlete recognizes that they have lack of choice in a certain situation, that's the starting point. It's highlighting to the athlete, this is how you could move. This might be a more biomechanically advantageous way to move that will help your game. Let's see if you can do it. Oh, if you can't, all right, let's try and train that, because it's another skill. It's a new thing for them to learn. Once they recognize they can't do it, then you improve their ability to do it. And then you apply more challenges to it. You apply more constraints, and then build it back up into situations that are closer to what they'll experience when they're going into their natural environment. Then you're really going to improve the chance of getting transfer into the game situation.
The term that I know we've sort of talked about, mentioned before, I think, is at least corrective exercise. And I think there you're talking more about what I'd like to sort of describe as selectives. So they have a chance to select an appropriate option, rather than being we're doing anything corrective as the idea that there is a correct. It's more that they have more options open to them, and they can select the choice right there and then that's best suited to that environment.
Yeah, it's a horrible term, I think, and I'm guilty of using it too, because it's just like standard within the industry. People use that because it's a simple term. Oh, you move this way, we want to correct that to make you move that way. Well, you're not really correcting it, and it's not like that way that they're moving is a problem, because we need to move that sometimes, but you also may need to move like this sometimes too. So let's have multiple options of how you move, have a bit more choice, a bit more variation, so when you are exposed to an environment, you can adjust to that situation. So having better adjustability. So I think, selective is much better than corrective, and just giving people more choice. And I think, that's the key. And I think language again drives some of the problems that we face in maybe the movement industry, and improving people's movement quality, how we describe things.
Nice. So the terminology component, again, we've talked about the issues of terminology, but also the words we use matter in terms of how things are perceived. And our ability to, I guess, use language also supports how we frame a question to ourselves. And if we have a certain framework of language and we think correction and correctives, well, maybe that's already sort of biasing our thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Talking of words, load. So once upon a time, I used to sort of think that I knew what load was. Now, many things seem to be load. So I don't know how we interpret what that means.
I think that's it. Like what you just said. What type of load are we talking about? That's the bottom line. And it's like, there was this buzzword in the NBA, and it was like load management. Like load management saved Kawhi's tendon and allowed him to be successful in the NBA to win a championship. And it's like, load management. What type of load are we talking about here? Are we talking about basketball load, basketball management? Because that's really the load that was managed, and what is that component that we're looking at? And it's just another general term that's thrown around that I think loses its value, because we're not being specific with the type of load that we need to be clear about. And general terms, general outcomes.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think load is you can depending, I think, on your what part of an MDT or interdisciplinary team you work within. Load can have a different meaning to you just as a standalone word. So I think for me, as an outlier example might be if I worked maybe within the player care, welfare, psych area. Load may well be psychological stress, anxiety, personal life, all of those kind of things. And I could talk about load management around my anxiety and my stress and just general family life, etc., outside of anything else. And often those are things that we, in sport in particular, we have in the back of our mind as an additional load factor for a player, because if you're stressed, cortisol levels, etc., potential neural load as another term, they're all things that then we're thinking about, well, how can we help this person better manage them? And I think, again, we talk about load within the literature and within the scientific community of, well, it's GPS load or it's gym load or, and it's like, well, it is, but it's also maybe 100 other things that we can talk about.
You often hear the unmeasurables, don't you? But it's like, how much weight are we putting on those unmeasurables? And that's why I made the point about like basketball management, because psychological load, tendon load, muscle load, cardiovascular load, they're all characteristics of things that are going on when somebody's playing a team sport or when they're performing actions. So you can have the same level of GPS output exposure every single week, but your perception of how hard that was in a game will change and vary every week depending on all the other loads that are going on within the game in that game load. So it's really hard to just isolate one certain ingredient or characteristic and make an assumption on a very specific area. So I think there's lots of context that's often missed when we're talking about load.
Even with sort of muscle synergy and coordination, if I'm have a slight articular restriction in my hip and I'm having to move slightly differently, well, the load on some of my other synergies is going to be changed. And that may well be transient, but I may well come in after playing a game and be like, well, this is tight. Well, the load of that specific
localized
issue has now been localized because of something else.
Yeah.
The load can go from the micro all the way out to whatever you want it to be from a macro perspective.
Exactly.
Again, we talk about load in terms of the things that are easy to measure. So load is weight or load is GPS because it's numbers, and we don't talk about load in all of the other areas and the factors. And like you said, from an RPE, I may run 10k and I've run 10k and I've taken the same number of steps and done it in exactly the same time. Well, when I did it the other day, it was easy. I could have done it again. Well, today, I've got nothing left in the tank. This is sore. This hurts. I feel terrible. All these other factors because of all the other environmental load, for want of a better term, that's going on.
Or it's it could be like a psychological fatigue that's causing the perception, or it could be actually, I don't feel fatigue. I feel pretty good, but my back is really tight today, or my hip feels a lot tighter. And it's well, what did you do 2 days before that? Well, we did an hour shooting session post practice.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So now you had some micro overload to a hip, to maybe your hip flexors or whatever that is, and now having that overload in that situation has then gone and caused excessive overload in a localized area in a game, and that's why you may be feeling that region of the body post game. So there's lots of factors to it, and then being specific on a micro level in terms of how you train it too, load thresholds.
And I think when we're talking about those specific things in terms of more joint specific, tissue specific physical load, that comes back to what you were talking about in terms of variation and variability of being able to move. If I have a narrow bandwidth of of performing a task, my load is going to be high in that area, especially when I'm under fatigue. Like the load for those regions becomes more. Whereas if I have potential other ways of achieving that movement, maybe I can disperse that load by sharing it around other joints or other muscles, etc. And I can kind of manage myself, and the load feels a little bit less during that time from a cognitive and a physical perspective.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's so aligns with my philosophy in terms of when I'm like talking to players and trying to give them an example of, okay, because you'll see often players using the same strategy, a high load strategy, for a simple, easy task.
Yeah.
And it's, why are you bracing so much when you may need that bracing strategy in this instance, which is important, but in this instance, like, you're so rigid and stiff, you need to be able to adjust. And that's variation. That's like being able to modulate the specific recruitment strategy for the task at hand. Why are you using a high load strategy for a low load task, or vice versa?
Yeah.
And that's a skill. And I think that's, an example of variation. And that's an example of, loading and how we load and what type of load is necessary for, or a load strategy is necessary for the task at hand.
Yeah, and not that I'm a physiologist by any means, but then you can take that right down to then energy expenditure and what's going on with the cells.
Exactly.
Well, if I'm always high load bracing, I'm going to be
not efficient,
so fatigued and inefficient because my energy expenditure is so high. Whereas if I have variability within my movement to perhaps do it in a more efficient, easier way, where I disperse less load or energy, but I achieve the same movement, I'm going to be less fatigued, and my muscles and cells, etc., have got more energy. Therefore, I feel less tired, and I can save that for when I actually need it.
Yeah, and it's not that bracing isn't an important strategy at times, and it's often a protective mechanism. And it's often linked to injury and fight and flight. So it's useful when it's required, but we don't need it all the time.
No.
And if we're using that for every strategy. And then often you see that the presence of that after injury too, and even when pain is dispersed, that can still be there when you've had previous injury. And that's where a loss of choice can happen. And if that isn't retrained or improved or identified, then maybe that is one of the reasons why injuries reoccur in the future.
And that comes back to our monitoring strategies of isometric strength. When I assess you, if you're fatigued because you've been bracing and using high threshold strategies, and I assess it, oh, well, you're weak. Well, actually, no, I'm just really inefficient and I'm tired. And when I'm assessing this muscle, I've now interpreted this badly as a clinician, and I'm going to try and fatigue that muscle more and strengthen it. When actually, maybe I don't need to. I need to offload it and give it some rest.
Yeah.
I need the rest of the orchestra to come in and, give this guy a bit of a break because he's playing everything right now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The terminology conversation is what I always try to do with this is go to units. What are the SI units for this? And if you can identify me that, I've got a sort of starting point of going, I know what you're talking about. But that seems really hard with load. I mean, I've adopted the term demand as a carry-all for the some sort of exposure that the athlete's under and how they respond to that, or the individual. I mean, the bracing story looks like a bit of a mismatch sometimes, between what the task requires and the response to the task by the individual, so that they're employing this strength type strategy to what is not a strength task, which seems a mismatch in terms of physiology and also what they're using, which let's preserve those strategies for when you really need them. Otherwise, you're going to fatigue those strategies out. Don't use them now. There's better ways and better time to use these things. So let's preserve those performance strategies. So that mismatch is a nice way to maybe pitch that. So load is a tricky one, and God forbid that we sort of think about actually sort of mass and weight has been sort of associated to load, for example. In the world of biomechanics, that might be the way. But I appreciate that other disciplines need to use the term load, but maybe sticking workload in there would be good, so I can differentiate between load and another load, and player load and the load we're actually talking about. So SI units would be helpful if we could. Going back to variability, you mentioned it, and selecting choices. There's an idea around variability of an optimal window of variability. Having too much and having too little being problems. So a bit of a Goldilocks zone for variability is what's talked about in the literature. Nobody knows where it is, and whether having too much or too little variability is good or bad. I think in terms of having lower variability, we can talk about the same tissues being stressed in the same way, but having increased variability, this sort of more random version of movement, what's our experiences or what we've seen around that could be, again, associated to bad outcomes for an athlete?
Well, there are more biomechanical advantage ways to move, aren't there? We know that too. So, like if you're varying too frequently in situations where you need to have a more biomechanically advantaged way to move, then you're going to be moving more frequently in a biomechanically disadvantaged way. So it's important to be able to move in a biomechanically advantaged way, but then it's also important to vary that dependent on the situation. So the variation, degree of variation, again, is situational, and you're going to have to adjust at the right time. But if you have too much variation too frequently, then you're too frequently going into a biomechanically disadvantaged position, which could put excessive stress or strain on certain tissues in the other extreme, as opposed to having a distribution when you need it.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I mean, from a sports performance perspective, I mean, the guys at the elite level they have their own individual way of achieving something, which has probably got them to the point that they're at in terms of being the best in the world and playing at that level.
100%.
So having a specific way of doing something is advantageous from a sports performance point of view. But I think what we're discussing is in having enough variation around that you don't always have to do that if the environment is forcing you to have to do it in a different way. It allows you to adapt better to the task at hand. But I think if you have too much variation, I guess from a organizational brain perspective, if you're going into something, it's almost like I've suddenly now got to flick through like this deck of cards to work out how I'm going to achieve this.
Yeah.
And so potentially your decision making may be affected by that, but also in terms of the position that you get in from a segmental perspective, it's likely that you do that less often because you have so many ways of doing it. And that maybe comes to the point that you said, well, maybe if I've only done this once or twice and I've got into this position once or twice because I've got so many other ways of doing it, do I stress tissues that I'm not used to stressing, whether it's a joint or ligament or whatever?
Yeah.
And therefore I pick up these niggly kind of like, well, that hurt a little bit when I did that. But it's just because you haven't gone into that position for such a long time.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, exactly.
I do wonder if those are some of the guys that maybe I think you tend to see them a little bit less particularly in the sport that I work in, but those guys that are a bit more hypermobile.
I was going to say that. Yeah, hypermobile. Exactly.
Yeah, they're less.
And they're always like, oh, that feels a bit here and there. And it's like they've got that sensation. They don't have a range related issue. Really good control, but all of a sudden they've got a random tightness or something or a sensation.
Yeah. And that's then I think they become a little bit harder to manage because they end up in positions that they wouldn't normally necessarily go into or that you wouldn't normally see within that population.
Yeah.
They have to have so much more control because they have so much more range of movement, and they have to have so much more strength into inner and outer ranges because their inner and outer ranges are just so extreme.
Yeah.
And traditional strength training keeps us often very in that mid-range that I spoke about in the last time we spoke. So actually taking these guys into more extreme ranges is more important because if that's one of their options when they play sport, I need to know that they can control it and they have appropriate strength to get in and out of that position.
Yeah, definitely.
I think those are the guys that kind of come in, like you said, they've got this weird symptoms of this suddenly hurts, or when I do that, and you're like, how on earth have you done that? Like what, and it suddenly becomes quite hard to clinically manage.
Yeah, yeah.
So rather than being the idea of this hypermobility, actually, sort of there could be just a contextually optimal position or ability to control how they move. So rather than going, well, you are beyond a certain normative value, does that really matter for the individual if they have the ability to control that additional motion? So for some,
yeah,
that's going to be problematic. But if they have the ability to control it, then maybe that's all right.
And conversely, I'd say I've seen athletes at the other end of the spectrum where they're perhaps a little bit stiffer than where you would like from a articular and from a myofascial point of view, and that's their makeup. Often they have less bandwidth and variability of movement because of their restrictions around joint articulation and fascia, etc., muscle. Their bandwidth is much more narrow, so it's harder to give them more options of achieving a task because they just don't have the range of movement, etc., to be able to kind of get into the positions that you want. And often they're the guys that I've found tend to get more joint related kind of issues because they're always loading the joint into those specific positions because they don't have other options. So I think often, anecdotally, I'd say the athletes that are sort of stiffer tend to have less bandwidth, and the athletes that are more pushing towards the hypermobile have a lot more variation and bandwidth that need a lot more control and strength and extremes. And so they're two very different populations to manage, but they're extremes of a sporting population often, I think.
Yeah.
Depending on the sport you work in. Obviously, if it's gymnastics or something, you're more likely going to have a lot more hypermobile than you are stiff. But
yeah.
All right. And I'm aware that we're sort of the hour mark at least. So I'd be, maybe keen to draw it to a close for today at least. It seems, again, we've covered huge amounts of territory, which is excellent. And thank everybody for their time. So any final thoughts there, Steve? The answer might be no.
No, not for me. I think it's been a useful conversation again. And I think the thing for me is like we've spoken about throughout this is taking context into the things that you read or you see or you hear at conferences is how does what that person talking about in their research really apply to what I'm thinking about and to the athletes that I've specifically got. Is it relevant to my athlete? Is strength important, or actually is that one part of a puzzle that I've already looked at and I need to look at something else? And say I think you hear the same kind of people giving the same message, which is absolutely fine. It's an important message, but maybe it's time to hear from other areas that might be the missing links that we're not focusing on, and that's why our injury epidemiology is much the same as it has been for the last couple of decades now.
Or worse.
Or worse.
Yeah. Awesome. Great conversation. Thanks, guys.
Well, Andy, great to see you again. Thanks for today, and we'll do another one. I think we're on again soon with Pete Drejevich. That'll be interesting as well.
Then we'll definitely have Steve back.
Indeed, yeah. Round 3.
If you want me, fantastic. Thank you.
100. Yeah, no,
Too good.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Lincoln.
Catch you later.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Hey, bye.